In the year 1346, the defenders of Caffa expected arrows. They expected fire. They expected the thunder of Mongol cavalry crashing against their gates, just as countless cities before them had witnessed. Instead, the dead began to fly. Bloated corpses, swollen by disease, sailed through the sky before smashing into crowded streets, rooftops, and marketplaces. Every impact carried more than the weight of a human body. It carried fear. It carried uncertainty. It carried something no wall had ever been designed to stop. The people inside Caffa had spent months preparing to survive a siege. They had stored grain, reinforced defenses, and trusted thick limestone walls to keep the enemy outside. But no one had prepared for death to arrive from above. For centuries, historians have debated whether this single siege truly unleashed the Black Death upon Europe. Some argue that the plague had already been moving westward through ancient trade networks. Others believe Caffa became the critical bridge that carried catastrophe across the Mediterranean. The truth remains uncertain. Yet one fact has never disappeared from the historical record. At Caffa, an army facing defeat may have transformed its own disaster into a weapon. Disease was no longer merely an enemy to endure. It became something that could be aimed, launched, and used against another civilization. It was a decision that blurred the line between survival and desperation. And once that line was crossed, warfare would never look quite the same again. Before bodies were hurled over city walls, before plague became part of the battlefield, before fear spread faster than arrows, there was a city that had become far too valuable to leave alone. That city was Caffa. Few places in the medieval world were richer than Caffa. Standing on the northern coast of the Black Sea, the bustling Genoese colony looked less like a frontier fortress and more like the beating heart of international commerce. Ships crowded its harbor almost every day, carrying silk from China, spices from India, furs from the Eurasian steppe, precious metals from Central Asia, and luxury goods bound for markets across Europe. Everything passed through Caffa. Merchants speaking Italian bargained beside Armenian traders. Greek sailors unloaded cargo, while Muslim merchants negotiated prices in crowded warehouses. Travelers from distant kingdoms exchanged news, languages, and customs within streets that rarely fell silent. Money flowed into the city almost as constantly as the tide. Whoever controlled Caffa controlled one of the richest commercial gateways between East and West, and everyone knew it. But prosperity has a dangerous habit. It attracts powerful friends, then even more powerful enemies. Long before the siege began, Caffa existed only because of an uneasy balance. The Genoese Republic had established the colony with permission from the Mongol rulers of the Golden Horde. Both sides benefited from trade. The Mongols taxed caravans crossing their vast territories. Genoese merchants connected Asian goods with European markets. As long as profits continued, both powers tolerated one another. For years, the arrangement worked remarkably well. Commerce often succeeded where diplomacy failed. Yet underneath that profitable partnership lay growing distrust. The Mongol Khans viewed foreign merchants as useful guests, but only so long as they respected Mongol authority. The Genoese, meanwhile, saw themselves as independent businessmen whose wealth increasingly gave them influence beyond simple trade. Neither side fully trusted the other. Neither believed the balance would last forever. It only took one spark. Historical accounts differ on the exact sequence of events, but several contemporary sources describe violence breaking out in the nearby port city of Tana. A dispute involving Genoese merchants and local Muslim traders escalated into bloodshed. The conflict quickly spread beyond commerce. Insults became violence. Violence became retaliation. Retaliation demanded punishment. Before long, what had begun as a local confrontation drew the attention of the ruler of the Golden Horde, Khan Jani Beg. Unlike many leaders before him, Jani Beg inherited an empire whose strength depended not only on conquest, but also on controlling trade. Allowing wealthy foreign colonies to challenge Mongol authority threatened more than prestige. It threatened revenue. It threatened stability. Most importantly, it threatened obedience. A ruler could overlook many things. Disobedience was rarely one of them. Jani Beg assembled his forces and marched toward Caffa. The Genoese watched from behind their walls as dust clouds slowly rose across the horizon. The Mongols had arrived. For most medieval cities, that moment alone would have signaled the beginning of the end. The Mongols were not simply another army. They had shattered kingdoms stretching from China to Eastern Europe. Entire civilizations had collapsed before their relentless campaigns. Cities that resisted often disappeared from the map altogether. Their reputation frequently conquered defenders long before the first attack ever began. The people inside Caffa understood exactly who stood outside their gates. They also understood something else. If the walls failed, mercy was unlikely. Yet surrender carried no guarantees either. There was only one choice left: hold the walls, no matter the cost. What no one inside the city realized was that those walls would soon become both their greatest protection and their greatest prison. The Mongol army surrounded Caffa with the confidence of conquerors. They had broken fortified cities before, many more heavily defended than this one. Experience taught them that every fortress had limits. Supplies eventually ran out. Morale eventually cracked. Gates eventually opened. Patience usually won. At first, the siege followed a familiar pattern. Encampments spread across the surrounding countryside. Supply routes were secured. Siege engines appeared outside the walls. Watchtowers rose above the camps, allowing commanders to observe every movement inside the city. The defenders responded with discipline. Archers occupied the battlements. Crossbowmen rotated shifts day and night. Food was rationed carefully. Ships from Genoa continued slipping into the harbor whenever conditions allowed, bringing reinforcements and fresh provisions. Unlike many inland fortresses, Caffa possessed something precious: the sea. As long as ships could reach its harbor, complete isolation remained impossible. Weeks passed, then months. The Mongols launched attacks. The walls held. They attempted to tighten the blockade. Supplies still found their way through. Every failed assault drained precious resources. Every passing week favored the defenders. It was an unfamiliar situation. The Mongols had mastered open warfare. Their cavalry dominated vast plains with astonishing speed. But stone walls transformed battle into something entirely different. Speed meant less. Numbers meant less. Even fear began losing its power when defenders realized the enemy could not simply ride through the gates. For the first time in years, frustration spread through the Mongol camp. Victory remained visible, yet unreachable. Inside Caffa, cautious optimism slowly replaced panic. Perhaps they could survive after all. Perhaps the greatest empire on earth had finally found a fortress it could not break. History has a cruel way of rewarding confidence too early. Because while both armies focused on each other, something neither side truly understood had already entered the battlefield. It arrived without banners, without horses, without siege engines. The first deaths seemed almost ordinary. A soldier developed a fever. Another collapsed, during guard duty. Then several more failed to wake the next morning. At first, commanders assumed exhaustion, poor sanitation, spoiled food, the usual hardships of a long campaign, but the deaths refused to stop. Instead, they accelerated. Within days, healthy men became bedridden. Within hours, some never stood again. The disease moved through tents with terrifying speed, leaving confusion in its wake. No formation could fight it, no sword could kill it, and no commander could order it to retreat. The siege had entered a new phase, one where the enemy could no longer be seen, and the worst was only beginning. The order was unlike anything medieval warfare had witnessed before. The siege engines were no longer loaded with stones, not burning pitch, not shattered timber, human bodies. According to the 14th century chronicler Gabriele de Mussi, the Mongols began hurling the corpses of plague victims over Caffa's walls, hoping the disease would accomplish what months of fighting had failed to achieve. His account has fueled debate for centuries. Some historians question whether he relied on first-hand testimony, while others argue parts of his narrative may have been reconstructed from survivors' reports. But regardless of those uncertainties, one reality remains impossible to dismiss. People inside Caffa believed the plague had reached them, and belief alone was enough to unleash panic. Imagine standing on the battlements. You hear the familiar creak of a massive trebuchet. You brace for another stone. Instead, a human body crashes onto the street below. Not one, several. The defenders had spent months fighting soldiers. Now, they faced something that looked less like warfare and more like a nightmare. The first instinct was practical. Remove the corpses. Keep the streets clear. Prevent contamination. Workers dragged bodies outside the busiest areas. Others attempted to bury them. Some sources suggest desperate residents threw corpses into the sea whenever possible, hoping the tide would carry danger away from the city. No one knew the correct response. 14th century Europe knew almost nothing about bacteria, fleas, or microscopic pathogens. People understood disease through observation rather than science. They knew sickness spread. They simply didn't know how. Every strange smell became suspicious. Every fever became terrifying. Every cough forced neighbors to wonder who would be next. Soon the bodies themselves became only part of the horror. Fear began doing the rest. Markets grew quieter. Families avoided strangers. People who had survived months of arrows suddenly feared something they couldn't see. Because unlike soldiers, disease offered no battlefield, no duel, no warning. If plague had entered Caffa, it could already be inside homes, inside warehouses, inside churches, perhaps even inside the defenders themselves. That uncertainty became almost impossible to endure. Modern historians continue to debate one crucial question. Could launching infected corpses actually spread bubonic plague in the way medieval observers believed? There is no simple answer. Most researchers agree that plague is primarily transmitted through fleas carried by infected rodents, although pneumonic plague can spread directly between people through respiratory droplets. Whether catapulting bodies alone could reliably infect an entire city remains uncertain. Yet focusing only on the biology risks, overlooking something equally important: psychology. Even if only a handful of infections resulted directly from the corpses, the psychological damage was undeniable. The Mongols had transformed the defenders' greatest strength into a trap. The walls that kept cavalry outside now kept fear inside. Every day the siege continued. Hope became harder to defend. Eventually, survival demanded a choice no commander ever wanted to make: Stay or escape. Many chose the sea. None of them realized what else might be sailing with them. When ships finally slipped away from Caffa's harbor, they carried more than frightened refugees. They carried uncertainty. The captains believed they were escaping death. Some may already have brought it aboard. Merchant vessels crossed the Black Sea toward Constantinople before continuing west across the Mediterranean. Others headed directly toward Sicily or the Italian peninsula, following commercial routes that had enriched Europe for generations. Those same routes would soon carry something infinitely more valuable and infinitely more dangerous than silk or spices. In October 1347, plague erupted in the Sicilian port of Messina. Contemporary chroniclers described ships arriving with crews already dying or dead. Survivors staggered ashore, carrying an illness no physician could explain. Within weeks, panic spread faster than official warnings. Ports attempted to turn unfamiliar vessels away. Some cities refused entry. Others acted too late. Trade never truly stopped, and neither did the disease. From Messina, plague appeared in Genoa, Venice, Marseille, then farther inland. Roads that had once connected Europe's greatest commercial centers now connected its greatest disaster. Within only a few years, the Black Death swept across the continent with astonishing speed. Entire villages disappeared. Fields remained unharvested. Church bells rang so often that, in some places, they eventually fell silent because no one remained to ring them. Modern estimates suggest that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population died between 1347 and 1352. Few events in human history rival that scale of devastation. Naturally, historians have long asked the same question. Did it all begin at Caffa? The honest answer is, we still don't know. Many scholars believe refugees fleeing the siege almost certainly helped transport plague across the Mediterranean. The timing fits, the trade routes fit, the movement of people fits. But others caution against reducing an enormously complex pandemic to a single dramatic event. Evidence suggests plague had already been spreading through Central Asia years before the siege. Caravans, rodents, merchant ships, and interconnected trade networks all offered multiple pathways into Europe. In other words, Caffa may not have been the beginning. It may have been one chapter in a much larger story. Yet history often remembers moments more vividly than processes, and no moment captures the terrifying intersection of war, disease, and human desperation more clearly than the Siege of Caffa. Whether it unleashed the plague or simply accelerated a catastrophe already underway, its legacy refuses to disappear. Because one question continues to haunt historians. What happens when survival becomes more important than morality? The Mongols may have answered that question long before the rest of the world was ready to hear it. Military history usually celebrates innovation, new weapons, better armor, smarter tactics. The Siege of Caffa reminds us that innovation has another side. Sometimes, the most dangerous breakthrough is not a machine, it's an idea. The idea that an enemy's greatest weakness might not be their army, but their fear. Whether or not the catapulted corpses directly infected large numbers of people, the psychological impact of the siege has never been seriously questioned. The defenders were forced to confront an impossible reality. Their enemy had found a way to attack minds as well as bodies. That lesson echoed through later centuries. Armies would repeatedly exploit disease, contaminated supplies, poisoned resources, and biological threats in different forms. Technology changed. Human thinking did not. Again and again, history revealed the same uncomfortable truth. Once survival is at stake, the boundaries that normally restrain human behavior become frighteningly flexible. The Siege of Caffa stands as one of the earliest and most famous reminders of that reality. Not because it proved biological warfare beyond every historical doubt, but because it revealed how easily warfare could evolve beyond swords and arrows. Perhaps that is why the story still feels disturbingly modern. Stone walls failed, not because they were weak, because they had been built to stop visible enemies. No architect could design a fortress against panic. No engineer could build a gate that blocked invisible disease, and no commander, regardless of experience, could fully predict what desperate people might do when facing defeat. That may be the darkest lesson hidden inside the siege. Empires often imagine their strength lies in armies. Sometimes it lies in trade. Sometimes in wealth. Sometimes in walls. But every civilization, no matter how powerful, depends on something far more fragile. Trust. Trust that food is safe. Trust that neighbors are healthy. Trust that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. Once that trust collapses, everything else begins to follow. Nearly 700 years later, historians still debate the exact mechanics of what happened outside Caffa. They debate sources, they debate transmission, they debate chronology. Those debates will likely continue. Yet one image remains impossible to forget. A medieval city looking toward the horizon, expecting arrows, expecting fire, expecting cavalry, only to watch the dead descend from the sky. History is filled with larger battles, greater empires, bloodier conquests. But few moments illustrate the terrifying creativity of human conflict more vividly than the Siege of Caffa. Because on those walls, the struggle was no longer simply about territory. It became a struggle over fear itself. And once fear became a weapon, every wall in the world suddenly seemed much smaller. If you enjoyed this journey into one of history's darkest and most controversial sieges, subscribe to Blood and Thrones for more stories where power, ambition, betrayal, and survival collide. And tell us in the comments, do you believe the Siege of Caffa truly changed the course of the Black Death? Or was it simply one chapter in a pandemic that was already inevitable? Until next time, remember this: the strongest fortress is not always the one built from stone. Sometimes, it's the one built inside the human mind.